Last week we celebrated Laetare Sunday, a virtual halfway point of our Lenten season, although it was somewhat more than halfway. Now we enter a stage of the season in which we are now looking toward the eventual celebration of the Paschal mystery of Christ's death and resurrection and the 50-day celebration of Easter. And as such, we have in our gospel today the halfway point in the Gospel of John. If you ever look at the Gospel of John, especially in the New American Bible and most scholarly editions that people will have in their homes, John is divided into two major sections. The first is the book of signs, in which it's a series of 7 miracles, only 7 in the Gospel of John, climaxing with the raising of Lazarus from the dead, that ultimate sign that Jesus is master even over death. The second half of the Gospel of John, and it is virtually half the Gospel, is the story that is called the Book of Glory, which encompasses the Paschal mystery, the death and resurrection of Christ, beginning with the washing of the feet, continuing with his final discourse to his disciples, and ultimately to his arrest, trial, crucifixion, and then the stories of the resurrection. We are reaching the halfway point in which Jesus is now saying, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." When we get to the point of his last discourse, he dismisses Judas Iscariot. And when Judas leaves and things are now set in motion, that's when Jesus raises his eyes to heaven and says, "Now the Son of Man is glorified." But here he's now beginning that process of glorification. He says, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified," and then speaks of the importance of his dying so that he could rise. Unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains just a grain of wheat. A very familiar passage that we have all heard before, and we even have a song that is based upon that line. And what we see in the Gospel of John from this particular point is a Messiah in Jesus who is very much in complete control of his own destiny and is eager to the point of being bound and determined to carry this mission out for his heavenly Father. It's very, very different from what we read in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Jesus speaks ominously of his death at the hands of sinners, his suffering and his death, but ultimately his resurrection. He's the suffering servant who doesn't say a word during his trial, and is very much emphasis on the suffering of Jesus on the cross, where he will say such things as, my God, why have you forsaken me?" in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, or in the midst of his suffering saying, "Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. Into your hands, Lord, I commend my spirit." It's a very different presentation that we see in the Gospel of John. So different, I would say. Now, there may be people here, I'm not asking for a show of hands, but I know at least over the last 2 decades, it has become the tradition of many to watch Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ on Good Friday as part of a private observance of Good Friday. Just for the record, I've never seen the movie. I have no intention of seeing it. I don't think I need to see that kind of violence in order to be inspired, even if it does have Jesus' face on it. But I often like to emphasize, although you can watch any movie anytime you want, Good Friday is not the day to watch the Passion of the Christ, according to Mel Gibson. We have Passion Sunday for that, Palm Sunday, where we have the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The Gospel of John is on a Friday that we call not Passion Friday, but Good Friday, a day of glorification, a day of triumph, a day of the King of Glory revealed as that King on the cross. And we have in Jesus not a silent, suffering servant, but as I like to say, a Messiah who won't shut up. At his trial, he's not sitting there pensively. He's responding to the Sanhedrin. He's engaging Pontius Pilate to the point of perplexing Pilate. At one point, he speaks of the truth, and Pilate says, "What does that mean, truth?" He's aggravating the people who are putting him on trial. Simon of Cyrene is nowhere in sight as Jesus carries his cross. He carries it by himself, determined to fulfill his Father's will. And even in today's gospel, we hear a play on what was probably a very well-known phrase of Jesus, who in the Garden of Gethsemane is, "Lord, let this cup pass from me." But in the Gospel of John, he says, "What should I say? Father, save me from this hour? But it was for this purpose that I came to this hour." He's asking, like, you expecting me to say I should get out of this? And then later when Peter chops off the servant's ear with the knife at the arrest of Jesus, he says, "Put your sword back in its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that my Father has given me?" A different twist on what perhaps was a well-known phrase of Jesus, where in the other Gospels he says, "Lord, let this cup pass." He is in no way asking God for that in today's Gospel and in the Gospel of John. It's not a time of darkness or total eclipse or earthquakes at the crucifixion, but a time of light. Jesus doesn't say, "Father, forgive them," or my God, why have you forsaken me?" But after his interrogation, his clothing and coronation, albeit of thorns, his presentation to a crowd that doesn't say, "God save the king," but "Crucify him, crucify him," he conducts unfinished business from his throne for the specific purpose of fulfilling the Scriptures. Before he says in the end, "It is finished," and he gives over his Spirit. A man totally in control, a Messiah triumphant on the cross, walking with the complete confidence that he goes before his Father, completely fulfilling the Father's will. And he knows what this means. And so we come to a point in which we are reminded of that as we come to these last weeks in the season of Lent. Not a period of penance that we began with, although we continue our observances, but we move now to a sense of confidence in which we know who it is who entered into this sacrifice and what it means for all of us. And hopefully we come at a time of growing confidence in the triumph of Christ on the cross. As we turn away from sin to embrace more fully the gospel, we come to celebrate just what is that power that gives us that grace, that stands with us as a church, and whose triumph we will celebrate in the high holy days of the Easter Triduum of Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and Easter Sunday, and in particular, the Easter Vigil, which I hope will be well attended here at Corpus Christi Parish. I'll speak more of that as part of my homily for Palm Sunday. But with one of the charisms and practices we engaged in was that of prayer in addition to fasting and almsgiving. Hopefully we engage in various exercises of prayer. But because we celebrate also on the same weekend the feast day of St. Patrick, although we don't celebrate it liturgically because nothing supersedes the Sunday of Lent, we still in many ways observe St. Patrick's Day, and he too has a prayer that exudes that confidence of God surrounding him and Christ going before him. One could say it's a prayer of spiritual warfare, which many people say is quite needed these days in the great conflict we have of our own values and the influences of the world that is constantly assaulting us, our children, our society, and so on. Many people are very fond of the prayer of St. Michael, which, by the way, it only comes from the late 1800s, but I have to admit, the prayer of St. Michael doesn't hold much of a candle to this prayer. First of all, Jesus is never mentioned once in the prayer of St. Michael, while the devil and his minions are mentioned twice. The only time we evoke the power of God in the prayer of St. Michael, which we believe is a power of salvation, is to condemn to hell those we already believe are there to begin with. And the popular time, although it's no longer appropriate now, is to pray that prayer at the end of the Mass, forgetting that we're asking St. Michael to do what we just celebrated at Mass was done by Jesus. Many people are very fond of that particular prayer because of the spirit of spiritual warfare, fighting against evil. Well, this prayer is 10 times longer than the prayer of St. Michael. Christ's name is evoked and mentioned in virtually every line, and when he's not, it's a list of all the powers of evil that name helps defend us and fight against. Many people might look at it, especially those who love to push spiritual warfare, and they look at this prayer and they say, "Oh, it's too long, it's too hard," to which I say, well, it's war. You want a spiritual pea shooter or a nuclear weapon? And what is that prayer? It's the breastplate of St. Patrick of Ireland, which I'm sure you've all heard of, and many of us are familiar with certain portions of it. But it's a tremendous prayer that goes as far back as the 8th century, far older than many of the prayers we are fond of today. And it speaks very much to the spirit and spirituality of the Irish, but also with the confidence that we see expressed in Jesus of John's Gospel, of one who is ready to go on and face the world with the confidence of who surrounds him and who goes before him. It makes an appropriate morning prayer. I arise today through a mighty strength, the invocation of the Trinity, through belief in the threeness, through confession of the oneness of the Creator of creation. I arise today through the strength of Christ's birth with his baptism, through the strength of his crucifixion with his burial, through the strength of his resurrection with his ascension, through the strength of his descent for the judgment of doom. I arise today through the strength of the love of cherubim, in the obedience of angels, in the service of archangels, in the hope of resurrection to meet with reward, in the prayers of patriarchs, in the predictions of prophets, in the preaching of apostles, in the faith of confessors, in the innocence of holy virgins, in the deeds of righteous men. I arise today through the strength of heaven, the light of the sun, the radiance of the moon, the splendor of fire, the speed of lightning, the swiftness of wind, the depth of the sea, the stability of the earth, the firmness of rock. I arise today through God's strength to pilot me, God's might to uphold me, God's wisdom to guide me, God's eye to look before me, God's ear to hear me, God's word to speak for me, God's hand to guard me, God's shield to protect me, God's host to save me, from snares of devils, from temptation of vices, from everyone who shall wish me ill afar and anear. I summon today all these powers between me and those evils, against every cruel and merciless power that may oppose my body and soul, against incantations of false prophets, against black laws of pagandom, against false laws of heretics, against craft of idolatry, against spells of witches and smiths and wizards, against every knowledge that corrupts man's body and soul. Christ to shield me today against poison, against burning, against drowning, against wounding, so that there may come to me an abundance of reward. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise, Christ in the heart of everyone who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in the eye of everyone who sees me, Christ in the ear of everyone who hears me. I arise today through a mighty strength, the invocation of the Trinity, through belief in the threeness, through confession of the oneness of the Creator of creation.